Go. Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Okay, thank you, Frank, and I hope you're well too.
Thank you.
Even though the summer is coming to an end and we've got to get ready for a new year. What's on my mind today is the English language because of the big article that the Guardian had on it, I think yesterday, pointing out that a number of things in what we used to think of as good English seem to be disappearing, and maybe we won't be able to communicate with each other as efficiently through language in the future as we have been able to in the past. And maybe English will lose its global stature. And it made me think of a number of things. First, I suppose I should say it made me wonder whether similar things could be said about other languages. And I think that it's interesting that a language like Russian, which is highly inflected, is, I think, also having this sort of, going through this sort of change. Unfortunately, I can't say anything about French because I haven't spent any time there for decades now, or other European languages. But I know that Persian, which is not highly inflected, certainly is changing, but in ways that in some one could say are similar to the ways English is changing, because they're structurally similar, both Indo-European languages, with a lot of foreign words and always borrowing words from other languages. And so the way people communicate with each other keeps changing. However, I think that the article in The Guardian fails to recognize several things which are very important in this change. And it's interesting for me to think back over my own lifetime and think what things have actually changed, and the difference between the way I was taught English when I began to go, not as I learned it from my parents, but as I began to go to school and go through the curriculum, and the way it's done now. And the most important change, I think, is the fact that in the early 60s, Latin dropped out of the curriculum.
Yeah, yeah.
And up until not much more than 200 years ago, Latin was in fact the most important language in Europe for official communication.
Mm-hmm.
And since everybody learned Latin and learned it properly, they learned grammar, and they learned the grammatical structure on which the historical development of English had been based. So nobody would say between you and I if they learn Latin, but now they say between you and I, and not having no idea why anybody should say between you and me, because they don't know that if you said to them, well, I is not accusative, they wouldn't know what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And English grammar is not taught in schools anymore.
It's not?
So that's one big problem.
Uh-huh.
But another big problem, which is not so easy to pinpoint, is the relationship between spoken language and written language. And my big example of this, which I come back to all the time, is Persian, which from the 9th century, so it's over 1,000 years ago, until the colonial period in the 19th century, provided the basic written language for a large part of Asia, from what is now Iraq to northern China, and from what is now the Russian steppe down into India.
Mm-hmm.
And since everybody knew that was the standard written language, if they wanted to have an intelligent conversation, they spoke in the written language. and what enshrines the values and idioms and grammatical structure of the written language was the classical literature, which in the Persian case was 1,000 years old. I mean, it started to develop in the 10th century, and the best texts were written between the 11th and the 13th centuries. In fact, that still, even in the Islamic Republic today, is an important force in the way the language is used. And of course, English didn't become the language that it is now until the early part of the 18th century, because it was between Queen Elizabeth's reign and then that all the strange spellings that we have in English, which have nothing to do with the way the words are pronounced, like enough,
right.
were standardized. And of course, now that certainly gives English a recognizable character on the global stage, but nobody has any idea why we have spellings like this.
Well, let me. I just was going to go back a little bit to the article, because the initial premise of the article was that failures to communicate as a result of declining English, if you will, were eventually going to lead to a reverse evolution of progress. And I read the article, which was for a newspaper article, well documented, it seemed. And as I was reading it, and I was going through the recitations of various examples of changes in the language, as some of which you just noted, I was thinking, well, okay, I can see where this is going. It definitely is representing a decline, and it definitely represents a decline in the way and manner in which we're able to communicate with each other, which will, of course, affect progress. But then the article did a U-turn and ended up essentially saying, don't worry, all will be well. Language is, after all, only a reflection of the way people communicate with each other, and it's always being modified. It's always changing and evolving to meet the way and standards that people communicate with each other. So I was sort of left scratching my head. I mean, it started out with a premise of saying that the lack of a standardization of proper language is going to disintegrate the way that we communicate with each other. Then it ended up summarizing, saying the way we communicate with each other is always going to be reflected in the language anyway, so don't worry, even though the way we communicate with each other is declining. So I don't know, I couldn't quite make heads nor tails out of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, what they don't say explicitly, which I imagine must have been in the minds of the people writing the article, is that it was the use of written language which made it possible for us anywhere in the world to have a single language that would be understood over a very large area. Otherwise, before that, language changed differently in each community of people who were talking to each other face to face. And what the reason that things like this have changed since the 60s is not only that we no longer have Latin as the basis of the way people learn to speak correctly, but that we don't depend upon written language in the same sense. We depend on social media.
Correct.
And social media are a collection of communities which don't interact with each other so much. And that means that, in fact, it is going to be difficult to maintain a language which is equally comprehensible to very large numbers of people. At first, we thought that English, since it was becoming a global language, was going to provide that opportunity. So that everybody anywhere in the world will be able to speak English to each other, but it's probably going to we're going to have difficulties if the global community breaks down into different sub-communities which communicate with each other more than with the global community. I mean, there really are some quite amazing things being written now, like should have been instead of should have been. Nobody knows the difference between then and than.
Right. Further and further and farther.
Yeah. So it really depends, I think, on. Of course, if we have global media, like I mean, if the Guardian becomes a global newspaper, it will provide the standard language.
Well, let me
write a letter to them.
Let me just ask you a question, though. I mean, are we just two old guys clucking away like hens, lamenting about the disintegrating standards? I mean, and does it really matter if any of these young millennials who speaks in emoticons and smiley faces has some ingenious idea and sits down and begins to express it? I mean, is that what we're talking about, that we're not going to be able to communicate some creative idea from somebody like this, or they're not going to be able to express it? What's the real concern here?
Well, I think the real concern is not that we'll always have the situation in which different groups of people have different slang and different idioms. The main thing is that we have global media that provide a standard for global interaction. And at the moment, of course, we don't have that. And because as we proceed further and further in the direction of globalization, we have absolutely no global structures except the United Nations, which is just a club of people traveling in airplanes.
Yes. Yes.
And it's interesting that none of our global structures that we've tried to begin to develop seem to be working, like the European Union, what's the one in, I've forgotten what the others are called because
they're so inconsequential. Well, but 100 years ago, what was the standard of communication when we say English? But English is represented where? In the Times of London, in official royal dispatches,
it was the English literature. It was George Eliot and Dickens, and I mean, literature has always been the base of this sort of thing because literature was the major medium that spread and provided a standard that everybody was aware of.
And literature was relatively impermeable to these slang changes?
Yes.
Okay.
And whereas in Asia, not only in Iran, but in what had been the Persian empires before that, spreading to almost to the Mediterranean in one direction and to China in the other direction, the classical literature from the 10th to the 13th centuries provided that basis and provides it today. And so that's why, in fact, Persian is still, even though nobody or very few people speak Persian in Central Asia now, nevertheless, Persian literature still has a great value.
I see.
But in English, of course, we can still read Shakespeare, but Shakespeare doesn't provide the standard for modern English.
Right.
However, 19th century English literature has done until fairly recently, and people do still, to some extent, read it. But I don't think the modern literature is providing any sort of new version of that.
No, I don't think that it is. And when not to belabor this point, but occasionally, if I'm in a bookstore and I'll pick up a novel, a fiction piece that's written in current day slang, I'll page through it to look for the dialogue between the characters, and if it's too current day, I immediately put it down. I don't want to proceed any further with it. It's too foreign to me. So I'm wondering if way back in the day somebody might have picked up a Shakespeare play and looked at it and said to themselves, well, maybe this is too far afield of the standard or tradition that I am used to. Maybe it's part of constant evolving. I don't know. But that's why I was surprised at the conclusion of the article, in that was that even though the language is always evolving, there's nothing to fret about insofar as humans' capability to communicate with each other. So
yeah. No, it is interesting that the languages that have had the most significant history of literature are the languages that are most important in the modern world. Chinese, for example, China wouldn't be a one nation state today if it wasn't for its language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the way its language has been used to organize the state for a very long time. Well, for the last 2,000 years at least. Longer than probably anywhere else, because Iran didn't become a nation state really in as it is today until the second half of the 19th century.
Right, right.
Then it was the British and the Russians who made it the nation state it is today.
Well, that's very interesting. We should probably cut it here, Brian, to make sure that we have our viewers riveted in attention throughout the whole session. So thank you very much, and I guess we'll look forward to talking again next week as the summer continues to draw to an end.
Good.
Thank
See
you.
you next week.
All right, bye.